Canyon have just released a new version of their Grail gravel bike called the Grail RIFT. And it is fitted with these, a brand new suspension fork designed as a collaboration between Canyon and DT Swiss, and it's called the F132-1. In this video, as you can see, I'm going to ride it
Just the record, that was not a crash.
tell you all about it and see what the difference is in the real world when I compare it to this. That's a rigid fork, just in case you're wondering. The headline stats are that this new Grail RIFT is an additional model in the top-tier CFR line. It uses the same frame as the other CFR ones, but of course it has the addition of the Canyon by DT Swiss F132-1 fork, which has 40 mils of travel, a game-changing lockout lever mounted to your handlebars that instantly turns the fork from suspension back to rigid, internal cable routing, an air spring, and it weighs just 1,340 grams. Canyon have had a suspension-forked gravel bike in their lineup for a while now, but up to this point, it's only been available on the Grizzle, which is a brilliant all-rounder, but one that leans more towards the adventure side of the gravel spectrum. What's interesting here, though, is, as I said, this new fork is available on the Grail, which is also a brilliant all-rounder, but a bike that was unashamedly designed to go as fast as possible. Now, why is that interesting? Well, we'll get onto that in a moment. Now, call me shallow if you want, but can we just take a moment to appreciate how good it looks? Like sleek and svelte and very much in keeping with the overall aesthetic of the bike. You can see that Canyon and DT Swiss collaborated on the industrial design. It means that you don't end up with that often jarring look of a very square-edged suspension fork just plugged into the front of an otherwise very nice-looking gravel bike. On to less superficial matters. Seeing as Canyon have spec'd this fork on their super fast gravel bike, I think we need to get into a conversation about suspension more generally, because for a lot of you, I suspect, it will feel like a step into another world to put suspension on a gravel bike. Like it will somehow change the very nature of what a gravel bike is. An existential gravel crisis! Exactly, and I can see why, right? Gravel bikes are simple, so surely this adds a complication. And gravel bikes are light. This adds nearly a kilo in weight, so is it worth it? And then lastly, almost by definition, gravel bikes have limitations as to where they can go and what they can do. So is there even any need? All valid questions, but frankly, there are no definitive answers. The fact is, suspension on gravel is an option, and it's an option that is going to be great for some people in some places, and probably not for others. I have not ridden suspension on a gravel bike on my local trails for quite some time now, so I'm very interested to give it a blast and let you know how I get on. Whilst I do that, should we also directly address some of those questions? To answer whether or not there is a need, we should probably first talk about what it actually does.
Absorbs bumps, dirt.
Right, yeah, okay, absorbs bumps. Your tyres already absorb bumps, small ones anyway. It's called pneumatic suspension. But we can see that with this trend for ever wider tyres, there's clearly a desire for more bump absorption. And with mechanical suspension, that's what you get, a lot more. In fact, you can see from research that DT Swiss and Canyon did that the results are really significant. So over various differently sized bumps, they measured the force impeding your forward motion. And with the suspension, it reduced dramatically, and they measured it at the hub. It was a super interesting experiment. Sadly, DT Swiss didn't want to share all of the juicy details. But what I thought was interesting is that they measured the force in this direction as opposed to in this direction. And it's interesting because this one is more about what's slowing you down. So, therefore, the reason why suspension is on their fastest gravel bike is because effectively it makes you faster. And the results were really significant. You'd have to say worth far more than the additional weight of the suspension fork over a rigid variant on just about any terrain short of steep and really smooth climbs.
Got to say, this lockout lever is blooming good, right? So, lockout on suspension, it's nothing new. At the twist of a dial, you can turn it from active to locked out. On mountain bikes, you get that remotely. I can't think of a gravel bike suspension fork with that, but the position of it here is pretty neat on the drops, because you can pull it with your fingers when you're riding on the hoods. So when you get out the saddle, you can just reach down, pull it, lock it out. And then similarly, if you forget to unlock it and you hit a descent, you can either pull it from the hoods, or I tend to descend on the drops quite a lot. And so then it's in prime position to unlock it there as well. Were I ever in the position to sprint for victory in a gravel race, that would also be handy. I don't think I need that somehow.
Next up, what about the simplicity angle? I mean, I guess to a certain extent, this comes down to perspective, right? A telescopic suspension fork is more complicated than a rigid carbon fork. It's true. Inside, you have an air spring that you adjust with a simple shock pump to suit your weight. And you also have a damper. Now, this controls effectively how quickly the fork will compress relative to the size and speed of the bump that it's responding to. And then, of course, how quickly it rebounds afterwards. For a suspension noob, this bit is super important, to the extent actually where a mountain biker could bore you on this topic even more than a road rider could about their drag coefficient.
So the really cool thing about having the air spring is just how tunable it is. So yeah, you can adjust your sag for just how much air's in there, and then you can play around with volume spaces. So when you're doing a jump or going around a really fast corner, whereas your low speeds when you're going over sort of like little small bump stuff. So it's all tunable. You can tweak little things here and there, and it just makes that a little bit.
First little bit of descending done then. Gotta say, it is bonkers how much difference 40 millimeters of suspension makes. And you might think, well, you've still got a rigid back end on the bike. Surely that's a limiting factor. But no, it's weird. You just sort of track so much more securely up front, and the back end just follows politely behind. And so where you notice it is in, you just don't get knocked offline as much when there are bumps. But then also when you need to use the brakes, they're more effective because the front wheel is in contact with the ground more. And similarly, when you need traction for cornering, the same is true there as well. So, yeah, it's not that I've not used suspension before, because I have, but just how much more fun it makes trails that I would have steered clear of for being chunky. I think that's probably about the best way to describe it.
To put it another way, an example of completely undamped suspension is a pogo stick. This, meanwhile, has been designed so that it's more active, so more comfortable effectively on smaller, low-speed hits, but then the compression damping ramps up when you hit bigger, faster stuff. So effectively, when you're riding down a chunky, rocky descent, you're not blowing through that 40 millimeters of travel. You basically get more out of it. While this fork has been designed from the ground up as a gravel fork, the tech inside it has been evolving gradually on mountain bikes for the last 30 years. So it's well proven and robust. Canyon and DT Swiss recommend that you give it a small service every 50 hours of riding and then a full service every 500 hours. So yes, it is something else to look after, but as I said, it's just a case of perspective. Now, having been for a bit of a ride now on the Grail RIFT, Adam here, who is GMBN's ace mechanic, is going to very kindly put a rigid Canyon Grail fork back into the bike so that we can compare the difference.
So your high speed's like the really sort of fast big
Adam?
hits. So when you're doing a jump or...
Adam!
What?
Yes. Back in the room. Once we've got both forks out of the bike, I want to show you something, okay? So if you have a look, you can see that the suspension fork, the R132-1, is longer than our rigid fork. Now this is because in order to be able to give you suspension, 40 millimeters, the fork has to be able to compress, obviously. And actually, it's also got greater tire clearance as well, so up to 50 millimeters wide. What this means is that when you fit it, the front of the bike gets lifted up ever so slightly. Not as much as 40 millimeters, by the way, because when you ride it, the fork compresses ever so slightly. So when you set it up to be able to sag by 30% of the travel. Even so, that could change the way the bike feels to ride. So to offset that, what they've done is to tweak the offset, actually, which is how far forward the front axle sits in front of the fork. So they've increased it by 4 millimeters. And what that does is it means that the bike still feels really nimble and agile, even though the head angle has been relaxed slightly. Yeah, touche. What that means is that on the trail, the bike still feels agile, but yet it's even better when you're going faster on looser stuff.
I think he wants this fork, mate.
Oh no, wrong one. That'd be a waste of time, wouldn't it? Yeah, just pop that one back in, mate.
Okay, let's rock and roll. Rigid forks. I was thinking that getting back onto the rigid fork would feel like a bit of a come down, but it's funny, you know, a great bike is a great bike, whether it's got suspension in or not. What's interesting is that when you're riding hard, or at least I find it, that I sort of notice the bumps less than when I'm going steady and cruising. Probably got something to do with the speed and also the amount of pressure that I'm putting through the pedals relative to the pressure I'm putting through the bars and the saddle. Like on smooth, in inverted commas, trails, the difference isn't night and day. But anytime it gets chunky or bumpy, you just have to back off a little bit. And I've noticed that just carrying a little bit less speed, I think, into corners. We'll see what the GPS says afterwards. Just the record, that was not a crash. That was me failing to put my camera back in its mount.
So what about that last question then? If a gravel bike is by definition limited in its scope, then what's the point of suspension? Well, how about we rephrase that question? Instead, we could ask, is it possible to increase the scope of a gravel bike while still keeping it feeling like a gravel bike? In that case, the answer is yes. This new suspension fork does change the personality of the Grail ever so slightly. So it's a little bit less of a weapon on the road. I mean, that fork is marginally less aerodynamic than the rigid version. And although you don't notice it when it's locked out at anything other than warp speed, it is still there. But off-road, well, the bike is definitely more comfortable, and it's smoother and it's faster down descents and around corners, and you can brake quicker, and it's generally just speedier on anything other than super smooth, buffed out gravel. Is it going to be for everyone? Well, no, I don't think so. If, for example, you are one of those people that's bought a Grail to commute to work on, and if you're doing it on a CFR, you are a very lucky individual indeed. But if you are that type of person and you've taken advantage of the integrated fender mounts and are riding to and from work in the rain, then the additional maintenance of the fork might well not make sense. And of course, it does come with a price tag, right? So the equivalent Grail RIFT is about €800 more than a standard Grail. Now that's not an inconsiderable sum, although we would expect other models to be released at a later date at lower price points perhaps. And then lastly, I also wouldn't have thought that Mathieu van der Poel would have chosen suspension when he used a Grail to win the World Gravel Championships last year. Although, interestingly, Freddie Ovett, who is a pro gravel racer, does use those forks. Apparently he likes them because anything that gets him to the end of a race feeling a little bit less beaten up is a good thing. And I think that is perhaps the most important point for the rest of us. Gravel suspension is more comfortable, it is faster, and it is more fun almost all of the time. You know what? I think that's a really important point. For my money, suspension on a gravel bike is going to make sense for a lot of people. It is comfortable, it is fast, and it is fun. And to those people who are normally a little bit long in the tooth, who try and hijack this debate by saying that a gravel bike with suspension is like a mountain bike from the 90s, and thereby making this cutting-edge piece of kit sound dated like a mobile phone that looks like a brick, to those people I would say, well, mountain biking in the 90s was insanely popular and it revolutionised cycling for millions. So that is not a bad thing. Plus, since then, mountain bikes and mountain biking has evolved. Now, that's no bad thing. Modern mountain biking is great, but those bikes, these new bikes, don't tend to be as good at pedalling, or they're not quite as nice to ride for hours and hours. Unlike one of these, this is a bike you could happily ride all day and all night as well, if that's your thing. And whilst I wouldn't tackle any black runs on it, it also makes a lot of mountain bike trails a lot of fun as well. Now, I'd be super interested to hear your thoughts on this. First of all, hit the like button if you think it looks absolutely mega. I'm already there with the like button. But also, let me know your thoughts on gravel suspension as well, and particularly these new ones. Now, I'll be reading those with interest.